Welcome back, sleepyhead. The rain's still falling outside, and the fire's burning quietly here in Hollow Cabin. These stories were made for nights like this, dark, soft, and slow. So check your brightness, turn the volume just right, get comfortable, and let's fall asleep together, here by the fire. The House That Hummed. The fire had been burning for hours. It wasn't roaring, not anymore, just low now, steady, with the kind of heat that seeps out slowly, like it's trying not to be noticed. The logs cracked now and then, a lazy protest, while the embers underneath glowed the dull orange of overripe fruit. Every once in a while, the ash shifted, but nothing changed. The heat just kept coming, slow and soft. The old man sat there in his usual chair, the one with the seat cushion that sloped to the left because of a spring that had never been fixed. His hands rested on the curved arms of the chair, and the tips of his fingers twitched when the wood creaked. Not because of the sound, but because he knew which creaks were normal. Which ones were his, which ones were not. He leaned forward a little, shifting his weight. The leather groaned. Another log on the fire hissed as sap boiled inside. "You want a story?" he said, not looking up. "I suppose I could tell you one, but it's a slow one. Not much happens. Just a boy, and a house, and a sound." He reached to the side for his mug of tea. It was cold by now, forgotten on the little ironwood table that had 3 legs and one uneven one, balanced out with a bit of folded newspaper. The mug handle had a chip, right where the thumb went, so he held it with 2 fingers instead. He sipped, winced, then put it down. "You ever heard a house hum?" he asked. You didn't answer, not right away. Maybe because it was late. Or because the fire made everything feel slower than it really was. Or maybe because his voice was always like that, dry as paper and twice as flammable. He turned his head and looked right at you. "I did," he said, "just once. It was a long time ago, but I still remember the sound. It wasn't a song, not really. It wasn't music, just a hum, like something waiting. Like the whole house was breathing, but through its teeth." He leaned back. The chair made another sound, long, aching. The fire cracked again. "It was summer," he said. "I was 11. My mother had gotten a letter." He waved a hand toward the fireplace, and the story began. Not fast, not loud, but like smoke that curls slow around the ceiling. The room around you was quiet, except for the fire and the clock. The clock didn't tick so much as click, a sound that echoed more than it should have in the narrow den. It was mounted high above the mantel, shaped like a hunting dog you'd never seen in real life. The tail was the pendulum, it swayed with effort. The rug was brown, or maybe it had once been red, but age had drained the color out of it like too many washes in too little soap. It was thick in some places and threadbare in others. Your foot sank into it like wet bread. A single lamp in the corner buzzed faintly. It didn't hum, that would have been too obvious, too close to the story. It just buzzed like it was tired of being left on. The tea kettle sat on the sideboard, half full, still warm. No one moved to refill their cup. You weren't really sure when you'd sat down, or why. The old man didn't often tell stories. When he did, they were usually about weather, about years when the river froze solid, or when the snow bent all the fence posts in the north field. But this was different. Maybe it was the way he said it, the way his voice went quiet around the word hummed. "I didn't want to go," he said, picking up the thread again. "To the house, I mean. It was far, too far, on the edge of a place I'd never heard of. My cousin lived there. Fourth cousin? Something like that. He was older than me and had a way of speaking that made you feel like he already knew what you were going to say. He shifted again in the chair. The cushion gave a little sigh. They sent the letter in June. Thick paper, wax seal, that sort of thing. I remember my mother holding it like it was something rare, like it might vanish if she blinked. I don't remember exactly what it said, but the gist was, "Come stay, we've room," and that was that. He looked into the fire like it was answering him. I packed 3 shirts, 2 pairs of socks, a set of suspenders I never wore, and a hat that was too tight. The train ride took half a day, then another half in a carriage. I was carsick the whole time. But that's not the story. He glanced at you again. "You're waiting for something scary," he said. "Don't. It won't come quick. Nothing worth remembering does." The fire shifted. Sparks lifted for a moment and vanished in the chimney's dark throat. Somewhere in the house, a pipe made a popping noise, just once. The old man smiled like he'd heard it before. "It didn't start right away," he said. "The humming. Not the first night. That night was quiet, I think. Or maybe I was just too tired. I remember the sheets smelled like starch and the pillow was thin. The window rattled, even though it wasn't windy. The moon looked small through the glass. Everything was quiet. But the house wasn't asleep." He paused as if weighing the memory. "Some houses are just alive in a way you can't explain," he said. "And it's not ghosts, no. Ghosts are loud. Ghosts want attention. This was different. This was like being watched by someone who didn't care what you did, just so long as you didn't do too much." He coughed softly into his sleeve. "You're thinking that doesn't sound so scary," he said. "You're right, it doesn't. Not when you say it out loud. But it felt different in there. That's the thing. You'll see. Well, maybe you won't, but I did." The clock clicked again. He stopped talking. The fire was burning lower now. Only 2 logs left, maybe less. One of them had split open from the heat, and its insides glowed like dull metal. You leaned back, and the chair under you creaked, just once. Somewhere in the silence, the old man's breath rasped quietly through his nose. And then, very softly, he said, "It started with a sound, just one, and I couldn't tell if it was coming from the walls or from me." The letter came on a Tuesday. Pale envelope, no return name, only an address printed neatly in black ink. The paper had weight to it, not the kind used for bills or invitations, but something older, stiffer, touched by fewer hands. The wax seal on the back had half cracked in transit. A symbol pressed into it, something with wings, or maybe just shadows shaped like wings. It didn't match anything in the house. No coat of arms, no family crest. Just the sort of detail that made people pause and say, "That's strange," before moving on. It had been sitting on the hall table for hours before anyone noticed it. The table was always cluttered. Keys, string, notes half written and never finished, pennies in a cracked dish. That letter sat in the middle of it all like it didn't belong. And it didn't. The contents were brief. An invitation, a suggestion really. A relative, distant, possibly invented, had written to say that the boy should come spend a few weeks in the countryside. A large house, fresh air, a change of pace. The note wasn't pushy, just final. As if the decision had already been made somewhere else, and all that remained was the packing. There was no real discussion. The bags were brought down from the attic that evening. One small suitcase. The one with the handle that stuck and the lining that had peeled back in the corners like dried wallpaper. Inside went 3 shirts, all starched and a little too stiff, 2 pairs of socks, one with a hole that was either too small to matter or too large to ignore, depending on the mood. A jumper, chosen not for warmth, but because it didn't smell like mothballs. Shoes that pinched on the left, a toothbrush with most of the bristles still intact, and a paperback novel he'd never finish. The suitcase wouldn't close properly. The latch had never sat quite right. A length of twine was tied around the whole thing in a tidy knot, as if that would keep it from bursting open at the worst possible moment. The train ticket arrived the next morning, tucked inside a second envelope with no message. Just the destination printed in sharp letters and the time of departure. He left 2 days later. No farewell, no wave from the platform. Just a brief reminder to write and not to lose the ticket. The station was nearly empty. A man with a mustache too large for his face stood near the far bench, smoking without really seeming to enjoy it. A woman sat with a sleeping child curled on her lap, one shoe missing. The train pulled in late, though not enough to matter. The conductor didn't apologize. He just nodded, as if to say this was always how it was. The boy took his seat in the third carriage, next to a window that caught more grime than light. The cushion was thin and gave a soft sigh when he sat down. He placed the suitcase at his feet, then spent several minutes staring at his shoes as if they might come undone on their own. The countryside rolled past, but not quickly. Nothing about the journey seemed in a rush. The houses gave way to hedgerows, the hedgerows to fields, and the fields to something harder to name. Not wilderness, not farmland, just land that didn't seem to want to be noticed. The grass looked tired. The trees stood too still. Even the clouds drifted without direction. There was a station halfway through the trip where no one got on and no one got off. Just a sign, faded nearly blank, and a bench that leaned too far to the left. No announcements, no reason for the stop. Just 5 long minutes before the train moved again. The seats creaked. The windows fogged at the corners. The air smelled faintly of old fabric and something else, maybe oil, maybe rain. Across the aisle, a man snored with his hat pulled over his face. No one seemed to mind. Time passed unevenly. Some stretches of the journey felt impossibly long, while others vanished without notice. The boy watched a row of trees flicker past like they were being repeated, copied over and over in the same sequence. He tried counting fence posts, but lost track somewhere after 30. Eventually, the train slowed again. This time it didn't speed back up. The station where he arrived had no name on the building, only a sign nailed to the wooden platform railing, painted in a shade of blue so faint it looked like sky in bad lighting. The letters were tall and spindly. Someone had tried to touch them up once, years ago, and given up halfway through. The platform boards were warped, soft in places. The whole station leaned slightly to one side, the way old sheds do when they've settled too far into the soil. There were no other passengers, no station master in sight. Just a single carriage parked at the end of the path, dark green, with wheels that looked older than the road itself. The driver didn't speak, just tipped his cap and gestured toward the carriage door. The boy climbed in. The seat cushions were worn velvet, the color long faded. A blanket had been folded neatly in one corner, untouched. The ride from the station took the better part of an hour, though it might have been less, or more. The road bent too often to tell, curling between hedges and over hills where the fences had long since stopped bothering to stand straight. The horse plodded along, unhurried. The carriage wheels made a soft clatter on the packed dirt, not loud enough to echo. There were few landmarks. A ruined wall here, a leaning tree there. At one point, they passed a pond with no ripples, not even a bird. The water looked like glass that had stopped caring about being a mirror. The boy didn't ask questions. The driver didn't offer answers. They moved through the countryside like they'd always been part of it, two small figures swallowed up by distance and dust. At last, the house appeared. It didn't rise out of the trees. It didn't loom. It just showed up, as if it had been there the whole time and the eye had finally adjusted enough to see it. Large, but not grand. Square, but not exact. Stonework that had once been pale, now dulled by moss and age. Windows that reflected nothing. A roof with too many chimneys, all unlit. The carriage stopped without ceremony. The boy stepped down, suitcase in hand. The door opened before he reached it. Not quickly, not ominously. Just the way a door opens when someone knows you're coming and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. He crossed the threshold, and that was when the quiet truly began. The entrance hall was too large for its purpose. Not grand, not decorative, just larger than it needed to be. The ceiling hung high above, barely visible in the dim light, and the air carried a dry chill that didn't quite feel like weather, the kind of stillness found in places that haven't changed in decades and don't plan to. The floor was stone, slate maybe, gray with a greenish tint in some spots, and dull patches where footsteps had worn a path over time. There was a rug in the center, long and narrow, its pattern faded into near invisibility. Something floral, probably, or vines. Either way, the color had drained out long ago. It made no sound underfoot. The boy was met not by his cousin, or uncle, or whatever Henry was, but by a man in a coat the color of old oatmeal. Tall, thin, pale in the way some people seem dusted with flour. He nodded once and turned without speaking, a gesture to follow. No greeting, no names exchanged. Just the slow rhythm of footsteps leading away into the deeper parts of the house. The corridor stretched farther than it should have. Paintings lined the walls, mostly landscapes, nothing memorable, all framed in dark wood. A few of them hung slightly crooked, but none looked recent. The wallpaper had a faint, repetitive pattern that threatened to lull the eye into closing entirely if stared at too long. At regular intervals, small tables stood against the wall, each holding something that might have been important once: a cracked vase, a broken clock, a stack of empty frames. There were doors, many of them, some open, some shut, none labeled. Some were narrower than others, shorter, as if the house had been patched together from mismatched pieces over the years, and no one had bothered to even things out. They passed a staircase, broad and sweeping, but worn. The banister had a smooth dip where countless hands had traveled over it. The runner on the stairs had balled at the edges, and two of the steps groaned even under the weight of nothing at all. The man in the coat led him to a room at the end of a hall. The door opened with the kind of creak that didn't sound deliberate, just tired. The room was simple. A bed with too many pillows, a chest at the foot of it, a wardrobe with one mirrored door, and a window that looked out onto a garden too symmetrical to be natural. The curtains were thick, velvet maybe, with tassels that hung like sleeping worms. The wallpaper here was a soft green, peeling slightly near the ceiling. The man gestured to the suitcase, then to the bed. He didn't speak. Just nodded once more and left, pulling the door gently shut behind him. The latch clicked with a sound that wasn't quite final, but didn't invite reopening. The boy stood still for a long moment. The room smelled faintly of lavender and something older, linen perhaps, or books kept shut too long. He set the suitcase on the chest and opened it slowly. The twine came off easily. The clasp held surprisingly. Everything inside had shifted slightly, but nothing had spilled. He unpacked in silence. Shirts in the wardrobe, socks in the top drawer of a small dresser that stuck slightly when pulled. The paperback went under the pillow, not to be read, just to be near. He sat on the edge of the bed and listened. No footsteps in the hallway. No voices. No wind outside the window, just the creak of the wood beneath him and the soft sigh of curtains breathing inward with the draft from the floorboards. Dinner was served downstairs. A different man knocked on the door exactly once, then opened it without waiting. Another silent gesture, another set of footsteps to follow. The dining room was long and narrow, with high-backed chairs and a table too long for the number of people present. At one end sat Cousin Henry, or someone who must have been. Tall, bony, with a face built entirely out of angles. He looked up, nodded once, and returned to his soup. No questions were asked. A plate appeared. The soup was bland but hot. Bread followed, thick and unevenly sliced. Butter that didn't spread quite right. There were vegetables, roasted to the point of collapse. Meat that could have been lamb or something similar. The boy ate slowly. No one spoke. After the dishes were cleared, Henry stood and left without a word. The others followed one by one, and the boy was escorted back to his room by the same silent figure who had led him before. The sky outside had turned a dusky purple, and the garden below the window no longer looked neat, just still. The kind of stillness that stretches, holds its breath, and waits. The boy climbed into bed without changing. The sheets were crisp and cold. The blanket was heavier than expected. The pillow sank in the middle like it had been waiting to be used again. The walls, painted pale, did nothing to keep out the faint creaks and groans of an old house adjusting itself for the night. And then, as he lay still, eyes half shut, he heard it. Very faint. A low, steady hum. Not close, not far, just present. It didn't rise or fall. It didn't shift. It simply existed, like background noise in a room no one noticed until the silence came. He lay there, unmoving, and listened. Could have been the pipes, or the wind, or some distant machinery humming through the bones of the building. But it didn't sound like that. It sounded patient. The boy didn't sit up. He didn't call out. He simply pulled the blanket a little tighter and closed his eyes. The hum stayed. Not loud enough to disturb. Just loud enough to remember. Morning arrived without ceremony. The light came in flat and gray, filtered through curtains that hadn't been drawn in years. The window panes were streaked with dust and something that might have been dried rain or just time. The sky beyond was a flat, dull white, the color of wet paper. It was hard to tell whether it was early or late. Either way, it wasn't bright. The boy rose, dressed without thought, and opened the door to find no one waiting. No call for breakfast, no footsteps in the corridor. Just the hallway stretching out on either side, identical in both directions, as if he could walk for miles and end up exactly where he started. He found the dining room eventually. The table was half set. A plate of toast sat under a silver dome, though the toast was soft from steam and already going cold. The butter had melted into a little puddle beside the knife. A single boiled egg leaned sideways in its cup, already cracked. There was tea in a pot, lukewarm and bitter. No one else was there. No one arrived. After breakfast he wandered, not aimlessly, but not with direction either. The house offered no signs, no clocks, no indication of what time it was or should be. Just more hallways, more turns, more doors. Some were locked, Some opened onto nothing useful: linen closets, storage rooms, an empty study with no chair. One room held only a piano with a single key pressed down and held there by a coin wedged beneath it. Another was full of coats, none of which fit him. Some rooms were so small they could hardly be entered. Others were too large for their contents. At some point, he found the garden. The door that led to it wasn't obvious: a side hall, a narrow staircase, a turn behind a drape. The garden itself was still, almost staged. The grass too even, the hedges trimmed too precisely. Rows of stones lined the outer edge, painted white on one side. The path wound between low shrubs and led nowhere. No birds, no insects, no wind. He sat on a bench made of stone that felt warm despite the air. He didn't know how long he stayed there. Lunch was less formal than dinner. A tray delivered to his room, left just inside the door while he was gone. Cold meat. A biscuit. Cheese that smelled faintly of smoke. A folded napkin with a faint stain, as though it had already been used by someone else. The rest of the day passed the same way. In the evening he was called, again by a silent man, possibly the same one as before, though he couldn't be sure, and led to dinner. Henry was there, seated at the same end of the table, face unreadable, eating with slow precision. There was no conversation, only the sound of utensils, the scrape of plates, the low clink of glasses being moved and refilled. Afterward, Henry stood and walked out. The others followed. The boy did too, not because he was told, but because it seemed like the only option. That night, the humming returned. It started earlier this time, just after he blew out the lamp. A soft, constant tone, low and steady, threading its way through the walls like a sound from the earth itself. Not loud enough to make out clearly, just loud enough to keep the silence away. He lay awake for a long time, not frightened, but not settled. The hum was neither near nor far. It didn't change. It didn't stop. It was like the house was holding its breath, not waiting for something to happen, but remembering something that already had. He fell asleep eventually, not all at once, bit by bit slipping under the sound. The next morning was the same. Breakfast alone. Toast again, this time slightly burnt. Tea already cold. The house unchanged. He tried asking one of the staff, a short woman with a round face and sleeves rolled to the elbow, how many people lived in the house. She smiled but didn't answer, just handed him a scone and walked away. He saw her again that afternoon, in a different hallway, polishing a silver lamp that didn't appear to be wired for electricity. He thought about asking her something else, but she didn't look up. Days passed like that. Maybe 3, maybe 4. They blurred together, stitched at the seams with sameness. He wandered the halls. He found new rooms that felt familiar, and familiar rooms that seemed wrong. Once, he found a staircase that spiraled upward for what felt like far too long. At the top was a locked door and a window that looked out on nothing but a blank stone wall. The humming came every night. It stayed steady. It never grew louder, but it also never stopped until morning, always beginning just as the lamp was extinguished, always fading just as light returned. By the 5th day, or what he assumed was the 5th, he noticed something different. A hallway he didn't remember. It wasn't grand or hidden, just unfamiliar. It turned at an angle the house hadn't allowed before. The wallpaper was different here, a yellow-green with a faded pattern of leaves or maybe feathers. The carpet was softer, too, and left impressions from his steps. The hallway bent in 3 slow curves. At the end was a door. He didn't try it. Not yet. That night, the hum changed. Not louder, but closer. like it had moved from the bones of the house into the floorboards, into the air. He could almost feel it, like a vibration in his ribs. Not threatening, just present, watching, maybe, waiting, but not in a hurry. He thought of opening the window, letting in the outside, but the latch stuck and the glass wobbled without moving. So he lay still and let the hum take up space in his chest. Sleep came slow again. The next morning, there was no breakfast waiting, only a note folded neatly on the floor beside the bed. It had no writing on it, just a mark, a winged shape, the same as the seal on the letter that had started all of this. He woke to the same gray light, the same heavy stillness, but something had changed. Not the house. The house was as it had always been, silent, vast, waiting. What had changed was harder to name. It wasn't loud, just a small shift in pressure, like the weight of a thought before it's fully formed. On the floor beside his bed lay the note, folded neatly. No writing, no instructions, just that same shape, the winged thing, pressed in faint black ink. Not ink, really, something thinner, something that barely clung to the paper. It looked like it might smear if breathed on. He turned it over in his hands. It felt warm, not from the room, which was still cold, but from inside the paper itself, like it remembered being touched. He ran his thumb over the crease. The paper didn't bend. It held its shape like it had been folded for centuries. He put it in his pocket. There was no breakfast, no tray at the door, no footsteps down the corridor, no sound at all, really. Even the wind outside had gone silent, or else the windows had decided not to let it in anymore. He stood at the threshold of the room for a long while, hand on the doorknob, not turning it, listening to nothing. When he did step out, the hallway was still there, just as it had always been. Long, narrow, papered in a pattern that seemed slightly different every day. Today the flowers were smaller, or farther apart. He didn't wander this time. He walked directly, but not to the hallway. He went to the library. He wasn't sure why. He hadn't spent much time there, only passed through mostly. But now it felt like the right place. The doors opened easily. Inside, rows and rows of books, all the same shape, all the same height, their spines unreadable from a distance. The air smelled like dust and something less distinct, old soap or a whisper of ink. He pulled a book from the shelf at random. Blank pages. Pulled another, also blank. He walked the aisles, running his fingers across the shelves, not looking for anything in particular. And yet, one volume sat differently than the others. Its spine bore no mark, but the leather felt smoother, more recent. He opened it. Inside was a single line, handwritten in faint pencil. Not yet. He closed the book, returned it to its shelf, left the room. The hallway appeared again sometime in the afternoon, though time in the house was unreliable. It was the same hallway, the one he hadn't walked before. Yellow-green wallpaper, carpet soft enough to swallow sound, a light bulb overhead that hummed faintly, unlike the rest of the house. He stepped toward it, stopped, stepped back, walked away again. He returned to his room, sat, tried the book he had brought with him, but the words slid past his eyes without catching. He turned the pages more from habit than intent. Outside the window, the garden didn't move. Not a leaf stirred. Evening came. This time, there was no knock, but he walked the hallway anyway. The dining room was prepared, lit. Every candle burned steadily, their flames unnaturally still. The table was set with more precision than before, every plate centered, every knife aligned. Henry sat at the far end, motionless. His face gave away nothing. His eyes, however, followed the boy's every step. The others were already seated, the silent staff, the woman with the rolled-up sleeves, the tall man with the coat that never wrinkled. None of them touched their food. The boy sat. In front of him, the plate was full. Meat, again, pale, soft, perfectly shaped. Vegetables in delicate rows. A cup of something thick and brown that smelled almost sweet, then not. The meal passed in silence, slower than any before. Time stretched thin across the room, hanging in threads too fine to see. The only sound came from his own fork. At the end of the meal, Henry stood. But instead of leaving, he raised a glass, empty, and lifted it, not to the boy, but to the wall behind him. Then he set it down, turned, and walked out without a word. The others followed. The boy remained. He looked at the plate. It was clean. He didn't remember finishing. He stood, left, and this time he didn't hesitate. The green hallway curved inward like a whisper. 3 slow turns. The carpet hushed every footfall. The light overhead flickered once and then steadied. At the end, the same door. Still no handle. Still that same breath of space between door and frame. He pushed. It opened. The room inside was not large. No windows, no furniture, only stone walls and the mirror. It had not changed. Tall, narrow, framed in black. The glass was perfectly smooth and impossibly still. It did not reflect him. He stepped closer. The hum returned, low, internal, as if it had been waiting in his chest. The sound rose slowly, then steadied. He couldn't say whether it filled the room or came from the mirror itself. He looked into the glass. Nothing. Then, something. A flicker. He saw a hallway. Not this one. The one outside his bedroom at home. His mother's voice, distant. Then silence. Then another hallway, darker, longer. A version of the house that didn't exist. Rooms rearranged, paint peeling in the wrong direction, stairs that ended too soon. The mirror shimmered slightly. He leaned closer. Now a reflection, not him. A boy, yes, but younger, standing at a train station, suitcase in hand, alone. The train never comes. The sky overhead is red, then white, then blank. The boy waits, grows older, never leaves. The hum grew louder. He took a step back. The mirror went dark. Then something deeper appeared. Not a vision, not a memory, but something familiar. A room, firelight, a chair, the sound of tea being poured, a voice. Have you ever heard a house hum? He blinked. The mirror was blank. He stood very still. Then he reached out and touched the glass. Warm, and then silence. The hum stopped immediately, as though it had never been. No echo, no trail, just a flatness, an absence. He pulled his hand away, 3 steps back, turned, left the room. He walked the hallway in silence. It no longer curved. It had shortened itself. As he passed through the final stretch, he glanced over his shoulder. The door was gone. Back in his room, the suitcase was packed, folded precisely. The clasp worked. His jumper was on top. Beneath it, the paperback novel, opened to the first page. He didn't remember doing that. There was a knock on the door this time. He opened it. The driver stood there. No words, just a nod. The boy followed. The house didn't groan or sigh or protest his departure. The door opened without resistance. The steps felt easier this time. The carriage waited. The road back was straight. The trees along the path looked taller than before. Or maybe the boy was shorter. Or maybe time worked differently now, and no one had told him. The train was waiting at the platform. Same seat, same view. The countryside passed by, but the boy didn't watch it. He stared at his reflection in the window, only it didn't quite line up. His head turned a second too late. His blinking came slower. He arrived home just after dusk. The house smelled the same, slightly musty, faintly sweet. His mother looked up from the kitchen and nodded once. "Good trip?" she asked. He paused, considered the question. "I think so," he said. She didn't ask for more. That night, as he lay in bed, the silence felt too still. He listened. No hum. But he remembered it, exactly. The note in his pocket was gone. But sometimes he still reached for it, by habit, long after it had stopped being there. Years passed. He didn't speak of the house again. But sometimes, when the fire burned low, and the clock ticked a little too slowly, and the shadows stretched too far across the floor, he would hear something in the silence. Not a sound, a suggestion, like something exhaling behind a wall, waiting. Not gone, just quiet. The forest sleeps differently. There was a path that no one maintained. It didn't appear on maps, though it was older than some towns. It wasn't hidden either. It just began where a ditch ended, marked by nothing. Not even a sign, not even a rock. The trees around it weren't any taller. The grass didn't bend differently. But the path was always there, the same way a shadow is always under a chair, even when no one looks. The man took the path on a late afternoon when the clouds had thickened but not yet committed to rain. His boots were waterproof. He had checked the night before. The tread was still good. His socks were too thick for the weather, but he preferred discomfort that could be planned for. He walked with even strides. The ground was gravel for the first half-mile, a loose, dull mix of tan and gray stones. Some were chipped, some were round. None of them sparkled, but a few looked like they might have if they were wet. They weren't. To the left was forest. To the right was also forest. The trees were mostly pine, with some birch woven in. The birch had started to peel. Thin strips of bark hung like paper tongues. He noticed one that curled into the shape of a hook. The branch above it was cracked. He kept walking. There were no markers, no mile signs, just progress measured by what no longer appeared behind him. A hollow log, a rusted shovel head buried halfway in the mud, a flat patch of grass where something large had once sat, possibly a truck, possibly a tent, possibly nothing. The man passed a bench made from 3 planks of wood. It leaned slightly west. One nail stuck out just enough to catch a coat if someone sat carelessly. No one had, not recently. The wood was dark from rot. A single feather lay on the seat. It was gray. No bird nearby matched it. He drank from a canteen. The water tasted like rubber and metal. He drank anyway. The gravel thinned. The earth changed. Packed dirt took over, tamped flat by footsteps that weren't recent but also weren't ancient. Someone else had passed this way. Not many, not often. The man didn't look down to confirm this. He just knew. Leaves lined the path's edge in loose, frayed piles. They weren't colorful. These were late-stage leaves, the kind that had already dried, curled, browned. If one had been red once, it no longer remembered. They barely rustled when disturbed. They simply shifted, as if embarrassed to be noticed. A bird called once. A single note, not repeated, not responded to. He adjusted the straps on his backpack. One creaked. The sound was sharp in the otherwise muffled afternoon. He did not flinch. He scratched his forearm through his sleeve. The itch went away. Ahead, the path widened. The trees began to thin, just slightly. Not enough to be noticed all at once, but enough to be felt, like when a room cools by a single degree. The light grew flatter, the shadows less crisp. Time flattened out with it. Then the clearing appeared. It didn't open up. It was simply there, as if someone had removed the forest like a tablecloth. The ground was patchy, matted with old grass, and a few clusters of mushrooms that leaned at angles that didn't agree with each other. A stump in the center held a pile of small stones, stacked deliberately. A dead moth lay across the top stone. Its wings were intact. At the far end of the clearing stood the house. It wasn't large, it wasn't small. It had proportions that didn't matter. 2 windows on the front, but not evenly placed. One higher than the other, as if the house had been measured by a different hand on each side. The front door was gray, or had once been painted gray. The paint had blistered. One blister had popped and left a shape that resembled a thumbprint. The doorknob was dark metal, possibly iron, possibly just dirty. The porch had a railing, but it sagged slightly on the left. 3 steps led up to it, or 4. From this distance it was hard to tell. The boards of the porch were uneven. A pale yellow moss grew between 2 slats. The roof was steep, but not sharp. A chimney rose from the back, tilted inward by a few degrees. No smoke, no bird nests. A single shingle hung loose at the corner. It moved slightly, but not with the wind. The wind had stopped a few minutes ago. And underneath everything, beneath the house, the air, the silence, there was a hum. It did not begin. It had always been there. The man became aware of it the way one notices a headache has been there all day. It wasn't loud, it wasn't rhythmic, it simply was. Not mechanical, not musical, not natural, but not entirely unnatural either. It came from no direction and all directions at once. It existed like temperature, like pressure, like fog before it becomes visible. The man blinked slowly. He wasn't tired, he wasn't alert, he was simply in between. He stepped into the clearing. His foot made no sound. The grass compressed, did not rebound. He walked 10 paces, or 12. He stopped. The house did not move, but the way it sat among the trees suggested it might have been waiting. Not for him, specifically, just for someone. The hum was louder here, not intrusive, not inviting, just present. The man breathed in. The air smelled faintly of metal and dust, like old wires, like forgotten attic spaces, like water that had sat too long in pipes. He looked at the windows. The glass was dim, not dirty, not clean, just aged. One curtain was partly drawn back, but the fold didn't fall naturally. It held its position like it had been stiffened. He did not speak. There was no reason to. He moved 1 step closer. The house hummed, as if in reply. The man stood still longer than he intended to. Possibly 5 minutes, possibly more. The house in front of him did not shift, though the way the trees behind it leaned made it seem like it could have. It sat in the clearing as if it had been forgotten by design. He took 1 more step, then another. The ground was soft now, not muddy, but not dry. The earth gave a little beneath his weight, like old carpet beneath old floorboards, beneath old promises. His boots made no sound. He approached the porch. At first, there were 3 steps. then 4, then, after blinking, 6. He looked down to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But when he stepped onto the first, the second step became the first, and then there were 5, or 7. He started over. He stopped. The steps were wooden, aged but not rotting, slightly warped in the center from use that must have happened long ago. The grain was visible, even through the faded paint, a muted green, perhaps once brighter. Possibly it had never been painted. Possibly it had only absorbed the colors around it. On the left edge of the second step, there was a dark stain in the shape of a comma. On the third step, a small splinter stuck out like a warning. The top step was wider than the others, or perhaps the others were narrower. At the bottom, a dry leaf had wedged itself into a crack and stayed. He stepped onto the first step, then paused. There was no sound, not even the hum now, only the slight, imagined feeling of being watched by something too tired to care. The man climbed the next step, and then the next. His footfalls remained soundless, but he could feel a pressure beneath each one, as if the boards were judging his weight. There was no give, only acknowledgement. A memory, maybe. On the fourth step, if it was the fourth, the wood curved downward slightly in the middle. A knot near the edge looked like a closed eye. He looked away. He reached the porch. The boards stretched flat in front of him. One was split at the end, exposing the bare, pale wood inside. A dried pine needle sat directly in the crack. It had not been carried by wind. The railing wrapped around to the left side of the house. It leaned outward slightly, just enough to suggest neglect, not collapse. The vertical slats were unevenly spaced, some wide enough to pass a hand through, some narrow enough to trap a fingertip. None of them matched. A nail head protruded near the corner. It was rusted orange, but smooth, as if touched often, though no one had touched it in years, or maybe just recently. He reached out and placed his hand lightly on the railing. It was colder than expected, damp but not wet. The moss growing on the bottom of the far post was soft-looking, too soft. It seemed to absorb light. A beetle moved beneath it, or the moss breathed. The man did not flinch. He walked the length of the porch. Each board was slightly different. One curved upward. Another creaked without being stepped on. A third had a scratch across it that looked like writing, but wasn't. He stepped over it. The window to his right was partially covered by a curtain, but not enough to conceal anything. The glass reflected the sky behind him, not his face. He leaned forward slightly. The reflection didn't change. He looked toward the door. The frame was warped at the bottom, where water had once pooled. There was a strip of wood nailed over the gap. One nail was bent, one wasn't. A spider had made a web between the door frame and the railing, but there was no spider. The doorknob was old metal, brass perhaps, though it had dulled into something without shine. A small smear of dirt curved beneath it, as if from a thumb that no longer remembered pressing. He didn't touch the knob, not yet. He turned slightly, looking back toward the path. The clearing was still there, unchanged. The trees stood at the same angle. The mushrooms still leaned away from one another. The sky remained a solid sheet of gray. There was no bird call, no wind, no movement. The house hummed again, louder now, though still not loud. It filled his chest, but not his ears. It moved through his bones like warmth from a distant stove. The sound had a shape now, not round, not flat, just present, not unpleasant, not kind. He stepped forward. The porch creaked once. It didn't creak again. He stopped in front of the door. There was a mail slot, but it had been painted shut. A small crack ran from the bottom corner up the side. The wood had been patched there once, poorly. A faint ring of dust outlined where a doormat might have once been. There was no mat now, just the outline, slightly darker than the boards around it. Pine needles had gathered in a fan shape in the right corner. 3 were broken, 2 were not. He crouched briefly and brushed his fingers across the floorboards. The dust moved, but not away. It rearranged itself into a similar pattern. He stood again. The hum shifted slightly in tone. Not higher, not lower, just different. Like a thought changing shape. Like a memory reshaping itself. Like something growing more curious, but not more awake. The man touched the doorknob. It didn't resist. It didn't give either. It was neutral. It existed as it needed to. He did not open the door. Instead, he walked the length of the porch again, this time slower. Each board greeted him with the same indifferent awareness. The railing watched without interest. The window no longer reflected anything. At the far corner, he found a small spider web clinging to a bent nail. A single pine needle had stuck to it. The spider was still absent. He leaned against the post. It held his weight. The forest behind the house did not move. The clearing was behind him now, but it remained in place. The path he had taken was no longer visible. Not blocked, just absent. The hum remained. Not inside the house, not outside. Just around. Like a wall with no edges. Like fog with weight. The man stood there, possibly for minutes, possibly for longer. Eventually, he turned back to the door. He did not knock. He did not open it. But the next time he blinked, he was inside. The man was inside. He didn't remember opening the door. There had been no pull of the arm, no shift in temperature, no brushing of air across the face. One moment, the porch was beneath his boots, and the next, it was the hallway. Just that. One space replacing another. No transition. No welcome. He stood there at the edge of a narrow corridor. The door behind him might still exist, but he didn't check. There was no sense that anything waited outside anymore. The house had already decided. The hallway extended in front of him, longer than it should have been, longer than the width of the house. The ceiling was slightly lower than expected, though not enough to bend the head. The floor was slanted, or maybe the walls leaned, or maybe it was just the light that made it appear so. The light had no source. It came from everywhere, but not brightly, just enough to see. The wallpaper was patterned in ovals, beige ovals mostly, some with a faded ring around the center, like a coffee stain repeated in print. The ovals were the size of a thumbprint, or slightly smaller, and they were spaced unevenly. Some were clustered, others floated apart, a few overlapped. The pattern should have repeated, but it didn't, or if it did, it was too slow to notice. He stared at the wallpaper. Up close, the lines were softer, blurred, almost organic. One oval had a smudge, possibly from dust. Another looked like it had been partially peeled and stuck back down. He reached out and brushed the wall with his fingertips. The texture was dry, flaky but not brittle. A flake of something came off on his hand. Beige, lint or old glue. He wiped his fingers on his pants. The floor was made of old boards, darkened by time rather than stain. They were long, thin planks, each slightly warped in a different direction. Some bowed in middle, some curved up at the edges. A few dipped down. Every fourth or fifth board creaked, always the same ones. He took a step. No sound. Another. A quiet creak, more felt than heard. He stopped, stepped backward, then forward again. The same board creaked, exactly the same way. He kept walking. The hum was there. It had not stopped. It was not louder, not softer, just closer. Not closer in distance, but closer to something inside the body, behind the jaw, in the ribs, beneath the scalp. It vibrated against bone, not air, as if the sound had been there all along, waiting to be remembered. The hallway extended. He passed a door on his left, open. Inside, a chair facing a wall. The chair was wooden, with a red cushion that sagged slightly in the center. On the wall in front of it hung a picture frame. No picture, just an empty frame, hung perfectly level. He looked inside. The floor in the room was carpeted. The carpet was thin, pale blue, worn flat. A small dent in the carpet showed where something else had once stood. Maybe a side table, maybe another chair. The indentation was circular, though it didn't line up with anything now. He didn't enter. He stared for a moment longer, then moved on. The next door was closed. The handle was metal, brass or bronze, dulled from age or indifference. The paint around it was chipped, revealing gray wood underneath. A thin crack ran from the bottom of the door to the floor. He did not touch it. Further down, a room opened on the right. This one held a bed. The sheets were white or once white. The blanket was folded across the bottom third, slightly off-center. There was a single pillow, flat, the kind of flatness that took years to shape. He stepped into the room. The hum followed, softer here, distant. The air was heavier, not hotter, just heavier. The window, closed, curtained, let in no light, but still had shadows. The glass had been fogged at some point and left to clear itself. The residue had formed into streaks that resembled fingerprints, not from a hand, from condensation or breath. He sat on the edge of the bed. It did not shift. The springs didn't squeak. There were no springs. He placed his hands on his knees. They rested there without tension. The wallpaper in this room was the same, but more faded. The ovals were flatter, less definition. In one corner, the paper peeled slightly, exposing brown drywall that had been painted over in a half-hearted stroke. The oval above the peel looked stretched. It pointed downward, like it had sagged. He leaned back and laid down. The mattress was thin but firm. The pillow accepted the shape of his head, not comfortably, just precisely. Above him, the ceiling had a long crack. He watched it. The crack started at the far corner and moved diagonally, stopping 3/4 across the ceiling. Then a second, smaller crack branched off it, like a broken arm reaching. Dust collected in the line. The dust never fell. He closed his eyes. The hum vibrated behind his teeth. He opened them again. The crack had deepened, only slightly, just enough to notice if one had been looking the whole time. He sat up. The bed released a faint sigh, or maybe it was the hum passing through the sheets. The air remained still. He stood. He returned to the hallway. It had changed, not dramatically, but enough. The wallpaper was the same, but the ovals now leaned in the opposite direction. The floorboards creaked on different steps. The ceiling had lowered, not visibly, but the space felt narrower. The light dimmed, but without a source, the change had no origin. He kept walking. To his left, a room with a shelf. Empty, except for a cup. White, porcelain, plain, no handle. Placed at the far end of the shelf, turned slightly toward the wall. A ring of dust formed a perfect outline beneath it. One side of the rim had a small chip. The chip faced the door. He stared at it longer than necessary. The cup did not move. He stepped back. The hallway shifted again. He passed a stretch where the wallpaper had been repaired. A new strip had been added. Same pattern, different print run. The ovals didn't line up. One set was darker, slightly off size. At the seam, the misalignment made the wall appear to bend. He ran a hand over the seam. It was slightly raised, warmer than the rest of the wall. Further ahead, the floor slanted down for 4 paces, then back up. One board groaned. Another pulsed slightly underfoot, like it had water underneath. He didn't step on it again. At the far end of the hall, a mirror. Tall, simple, framed in dark wood. No carvings. It leaned slightly forward from the wall, or the wall leaned away from it. He looked into the mirror. He saw the hallway, the walls, the wallpaper, the ovals, the light, but not himself. He moved his hand. No reflection. He stepped to the side. Nothing changed. He stood in front of the mirror for a long time. He reached out. His fingers met glass. Cold, solid, real. Still no reflection. He looked closer. The wallpaper in the mirror showed a tear, a rip he hadn't noticed. He turned, looked behind him. The wall was whole. He looked back at the mirror. The tear remained. He stepped away. The hallway was longer now, or he had shrunk. The distance stretched. He turned and walked. The floor creaked more now, every step a soft complaint. The hum in his bones kept pace. It matched the rhythm of his walk, or made the rhythm. He passed a new room. This one had no door. Inside, a lamp with no bulb turned on. The shade was yellowed, dented. The cord plugged into nothing. A moth fluttered inside the shade, or maybe it was dead. He didn't go in. He passed another mirror, smaller, oval, nailed directly into the wall. This one showed his eyes, just the eyes, nothing else. He didn't stop. The hallway ended at a door, flat, unadorned, no knob, no hinges. From beneath it, a line of light, pale, greenish. The hum pulsed there, stronger, deeper. He didn't open it. He turned. The hallway behind him was gone, replaced by a stairway. The stairs led down. The stairs were shallow. He expected a descent, but they barely dipped. Each step was wide and flat, like they had been made for resting, not climbing. There were 7 of them, then 8, then possibly 9, though he couldn't remember stepping more than 6. The air was cooler here, not basement cool, but cellar cool. It didn't move. It didn't settle. It simply was. A preserved kind of cold, like breath held too long. At the bottom, there was a narrow room. It might once have been a kitchen. A wooden table sat to the left, rectangular, one leg shorter than the others. It rocked slightly even when untouched. A chair stood beside it, but it faced the wall. On the wall was a nail with no picture. Above the nail, a faint line of cleaner paint, a ghost frame. To the right was a counter, bare. The wood was scratched and pale, as though someone had scrubbed too hard long ago and stopped without finishing. Above the counter, a row of cabinets, closed, all closed. One handle had fallen off and been nailed back on, upside down. The floor was stone, uneven, slightly convexed in the center, as if the room had settled around it. Dust had gathered in the cracks between stones, gray, soft, untouched. There were no footprints, not even his own. At the far end of the room stood a pantry door. It was ajar, just slightly. The man walked toward it, each footstep absorbed by the stones. Not muffled, devoured. His motion stirred nothing. The dust didn't rise. He stopped at the pantry. The door was white, or had been. Flakes of old paint had peeled away, but not enough to reveal anything useful underneath. A small round knob, wooden, splintered at the back. One single hair clung to it. Not long, not short, just there. He opened the door. The pantry was deeper than expected. It held cans, just cans. No shelves, no boxes, no baskets, no dry goods, no labels, just cans. Each the same size, stacked without symmetry. Some leaned, some sat upright. Some were sideways, pushed to the back. Some were nested into corners where the wood behind them had warped, leaving shadows that didn't match the light. There were no markings, not on the tops, not on the sides. No expiration dates, no dents, except one. He picked it up. It was warm. He put it down. He picked another, cold. Another, room temperature. He turned one over in his hands. The bottom had a ring of rust, just enough to stain, not enough to collapse. He turned another. It was pristine, metallic, slightly too light. He picked up the dented one. The dent was in the shape of a triangle, not sharp, not blunt, familiar but not identifiable. He held it to his ear. The hum was louder, not inside the can, through it, as though the metal was helping the house speak. He lowered the can. The hum returned to its regular tone, back in his bones, back in the walls. He set the can down and stepped deeper into the pantry. There were more cans than the space should allow. The walls didn't extend. The back wall remained visible. But somehow the number increased the more he looked. One stack became 5. A corner became a pile. One can had rolled onto its side and stopped perfectly perpendicular to the nearest wall. He picked it up. This one had weight. He shook it. No sound. He placed it gently back down. He leaned against the doorframe. He was not hungry, but he remembered hunger. That slow hollowness that made thoughts feel heavier, like walking through water. He remembered that feeling, but it did not come. The house was full of the memory of hunger, not the thing itself. He looked again at the cans. Some of them were dusty, others clean. One looked wet, but was not. Its surface had a sheen that didn't reflect properly. The light bounced in the wrong direction, or failed to bounce at all. He reached out to open one. There was no opener, no pull tab, no tool. He tried anyway. His fingernails scraped the lid. It left a mark, but nothing gave. He pressed harder. The can vibrated in response, not visibly, internally. He set it down. The pantry sighed. Not a wind, not a creak, just a soft, settling shift in the air, like something exhaling from behind the walls. He stepped out. The cans remained. The door swung halfway shut on its own. He didn't stop it. He turned back to the table. A cup now sat on it. Plain, white, no handle. The same kind of cup he'd seen upstairs. But this one had water in it. Possibly water. He didn't drink. He didn't sit. The chair still faced the wall. Its legs were uneven. One was carved with small notches, not deep enough to be letters, but repeated. 7 notches. No pattern, just distance. He turned in a slow circle. The kitchen, if it was a kitchen, remained unchanged. Still air, still silence, still stone, still cans behind the door. He stepped to the sink. There was no faucet, no knobs, no pipe, just a basin. Metal, rusted at the corners, dry. A single spoon lay at the bottom. It was turned upside down. The handle curved gently upward, like the shape of a swan's neck or a question mark laid flat. He picked it up. It was warm. He placed it on the counter. It was cold. He blinked. The spoon was gone. He did not search for it. The hum moved slightly, settling low in his stomach now. It pulsed gently, like a second heartbeat. one that had existed long before he noticed it. He walked back to the pantry door, opened it. The cans had changed places. One now sat alone in the center of the floor, the dented one, still shaped like a triangle. He left it there. The pantry did not object. He closed the door. The click was soft but final. The hum throbbed once, just once, and resumed its rhythm. He stood in the center of the kitchen, but it no longer felt like the center. The room was not a room. It was a pause, a held breath, a waiting space. He did not eat. He was not full. He was not empty. He turned to the stairwell. The steps were flatter now, less distinct, more like a slope pretending to be a staircase. He ascended without counting. The house welcomed the return with silence. The man walked out of the pantry and into a hallway that might have been the same one he entered before, but something about it had changed. The shape of the corridor, or the texture of the walls, or the color of the air. He could not say exactly what it was. The wallpaper, still printed with its weary pattern of overlapping beige ovals, had faded further, as if the house had aged while he was gone. Some ovals leaned to the left, some to the right. One strip of paper had peeled back and then curled in on itself, like it had grown shy of being seen. The floor beneath him felt more certain than before. Each wooden board, darkened by time and use, yielded only slightly beneath his feet. Not soft, not springy, but tired. The boards made sounds now, small ones, consistent and distant, like they were not protesting his weight, but remembering it. Each step carried the echo of 100 other steps, all layered beneath the surface, muffled and stacked like blankets in an attic. He noticed that one floorboard gave more than the others, and made a long, slow groan when he crossed it, as if it were reluctantly agreeing to let him pass. There were no windows along the hallway now. Either there never had been, or the house had drawn them inward, hidden them behind its walls like thoughts too fragile to be exposed. The light was even but dim, with no clear source, casting everything in the same dull shade of shadowed gray. It made no demands and offered no guidance. The man kept walking. Eventually, the hallway opened into a wide room with no name. It had the proportions of a parlor, but there was no furniture except for a low bench without a cushion pushed against the far wall, and a fireplace that showed no signs of ever having been used. A thin ring of soot rimmed the inside of the hearth, but there was no ash, no wood, no tools. A faint line of cobweb ran from the inside corner to the edge, unmoving. The air here smelled like chalk and iron, a mixture too subtle to confirm, but too present to ignore. The man walked to the center of the room and looked down. The floorboards here were wider, laid in a slightly different pattern, diagonal rather than parallel. They created a strange sense of slope, like the room was sliding sideways, but the walls held it still. The boards were darker at the edges, lighter in the middle, worn smooth by something that had passed repeatedly over the same track. He tried to imagine what had walked here before. He failed. A mirror hung above the fireplace. It was rectangular, framed in a plain wood that had been painted over with a single coat of matte white. The paint had chipped away at the corners, and the grain showed through in places. The glass was mostly clean, but a faint haze clung to the bottom edge, as if a breath had once been exhaled there and never fully disappeared. When the man stepped in front of it, he saw the room reflected exactly: floor, fireplace, walls, even the angle of the floorboards, but not himself. His body cast no reflection. He looked for his shoulder, his feet, a shadow. There was nothing. He stood for a long moment, then stepped away from the mirror. The room offered nothing else. No doorway forward, No way back. Still, he did not feel trapped. The house had not closed around him. It had simply stopped opening. He turned and retraced his steps across the room. This time, the bench was gone. The walls looked the same, the floor too, but the weight of the air had changed slightly, as if the temperature had dropped by 1 degree or the oxygen had thinned by 1 breath. He moved back through the doorway and returned to the hallway, though it no longer seemed familiar. The wallpaper was gone now. In its place were wooden slats, painted gray-blue, nailed vertically along the wall. Some of the nails stuck out a little. One had a string tied to it. The string led nowhere. It ended in a loose knot that had frayed at the edge. Dust gathered at the base of the wall in small mounds, soft and still. The man placed a hand on the wall. The wood was cool, dry, and faintly vibrating. Not with motion, but with memory. The hum was still present, though it no longer sounded like a tone. It had become part of the structure, something inside the walls, inside the floor, inside his chest. It did not rise or fall. It held steady, like the background radiation of a forgotten machine. He continued walking and found himself in a narrow room that may have been a bedroom once. There was a bed pushed against the wall, made neatly with a gray blanket folded at the foot. A pillow sat at the top, square, flat, unused. The sheets were tight. The mattress was low. The bed was centered exactly beneath a small circular ceiling vent that did not move, did not open, and did not hum. There was a chair in the corner of the room. It matched the one he had seen earlier, or perhaps it was the same one. The cushion was red and worn. A small table sat next to it. On the table, a cup, white, no handle, filled with a dark liquid. He did not pick it up. He sat in the chair and waited for something. Nothing came. The hum was softer here, or he had adjusted to it. It no longer seemed to come from the house. It seemed to come from inside his ears, or inside the blood that moved through his arms. He stood again. The bed was gone. The table remained. The cup remained. The room was larger now, the walls farther apart, but the door had stayed where it was. He walked through it again and was back in a hallway. This time, the hallway led to a staircase. The steps were wide and shallow as before. They sloped downward gently, more like a ramp than a descent. Each step was covered in thin gray carpet that had worn smooth in the center, exposing the rough weave beneath. The railing was a single wooden pole, sanded down by use, slightly bowed in the middle, anchored by posts that didn't match. One was square, one was round, one had been painted but never finished. He descended slowly. At the bottom, a room with no doors, no windows, no furniture. The floor was the same boards as before, but wider, smoother. There were no knots, no nails, just the clean grain of old wood, running in long, uninterrupted lines. The ceiling was high and flat. No light fixtures, no seams. The walls were a single shade of gray, like concrete left to dry without smoothing. In the center of the floor, a rectangle of darker color, perhaps once a rug, perhaps just a shadow of one. He stepped onto it. The hum stopped. For the first time, there was silence. Not absence of sound, total stillness, complete, final. He knelt. He placed both palms on the floor. It was warm, not hot, not cold, not vibrating, just warm, like breath held in cupped hands. He lay down. The boards did not resist. They remembered him. And for the first time in a long while, the night stayed quiet.